Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm Ian Shapiro, Director of the McMillan Center, which sponsors the Coca-Cola World Fund Lecture. We are delighted to host Deborah Browdingham, the Bernard L. Schwartz Professor of Political Economy at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, as well as its Director of the International Development Program and the Director of the China-Africa Research Initiative, as the speaker for today's Coca-Cola World Fund Lecture at Yale. The lecture was established in 1992 by the late Robert Wayzata, former chair and CEO of the Coca-Cola Company and a graduate of the Yale class of 1953. Professor Browdingham's teaching and research focuses on international development strategies, on governance, and foreign aid. She's twice won Fulbright Research Awards and is the recipient of fellowships from the Council on Foreign Relations, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and research grants from the UK Economic and Social Research Council and the UK Center for Economic Policy and Research. She served as a consultant for many institutions, including Transparency International, the UN, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, USAID, and she has often provided commentary to the Financial Times, the New York Times, the Guardian, CNN, NPR, Al Jazeera, and MSNBC. She's been a visiting scholar at the World Bank, a senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute, and she's advised more than a dozen governments on China-Africa relations. She is the author of a very well-known book called The Dragon's Gift, The Real Story of China in Africa, and indeed it was through reading that book that I first became aware of Professor Browdingham's work. Most of us have this kind of cartoon strip image of Chinese activity in Africa as geared to extracting natural resources and little or anything else. But that's just one snapshot of one phase of China's very long development in Africa, which, as she shows in incredibly rich detail in that book, was first of all shaped by their experience of Japanese imperialism, and then responded and evolved and changed in reaction to various things, including development fads in the West. As every decade there's a new fad in the World Bank and the IMF, and the Washington Consensus changes, and often when it changes, Chinese investment strategy has responded to those and moved into things that have been vacated. She also shows how they have Chinese policymakers on their international aid and investment have a learning curve. They learn from their mistakes, they adapt, and they evolve. She also shows in very rich detail that they're not only interested in extractive industries. If you look at what they're doing in Mauritius, for example, it's service sector, it's all kinds of other things. And then in the last parts of that book, she talks about their evolution into partnerships with local governments, with local firms, and with international firms from Europe, from the US, and elsewhere doing work doing investment in Africa. So it's really this book, it's the gold standard for research on what China has done in Africa. We were just discussing earlier the incredible amount of evidence that she was able to get hold of about Chinese thinking on development that most of us would have guessed wouldn't be available. And the book was published, I think, 2009, was it? Yeah, so we kept waiting for something to come along that would update all of this. But I've been reading pretty much what's been coming out, and there hasn't been anything that's come along remotely as good that has brought up to date the Chinese thinking until now. And so Deborah Browdingham has a new book, Will Africa Feed China? that is the source of her remarks today. And we're going to get a sneak preview. I believe the publication date of the book is actually today. So congratulations and welcome.
Thank you very much. So, does this work? No.
Are the slides working?
They are, I believe.
Do I use this?
Yes, or the arrows.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, okay. All right, so. Okay, thank you. That was a lovely introduction. You guys really do it well here. So, thank you all for coming. I know there was a lot of competition. The main competition was the sunshine, and I really appreciate that you spent the last part of this beautiful day that you're going to be spending coming to hear me talk about my new book. So thank you very much for that. And the book did just officially get published today, although I have this copy, so I was able to get a hold of it a little bit early. Okay, so if I can work this. What does China want? I was just talking to two students about this. What does China want? And I think this is one of the questions that we've been asking ourselves a lot in the United States in recent years. What does China want? And how will China seek to meet its needs? And what does this mean for the United States? What does it mean for the rest of the world? China's rise is probably the most important geopolitical phenomenon certainly of this century, young as it is. And in my research, I'm very mindful of something that John Pomfret from the Washington Post said a few years ago. And that is, overestimating the challenge from China could be just as dangerous as underestimating it. So I keep that in mind when I'm doing my research. Now, China is often portrayed as a threat in Africa. So this is the idea of overestimating the challenge. We can see, for example, this Economist picture of the new colonialist up there, the idea that China's reaching in with a big communist hand to pluck those barrels of oil. And then down here is the China, the dragon and the ostrich. This is by an African colleague of mine. But it's generally seen as a threat. And I think nowhere is the gap between our perceptions and the reality of what China is actually doing in Africa larger than in the issue of land grabbing and agricultural investment in Africa. So China has only from 7 to 9% of the world's arable land. People disagree on how much. And they have 20% of its population. And about 20 years ago, Lester Brown wrote a little book. Does anyone know the title of it? Who Will Feed China? Who Will Feed China? And Lester Brown wrote this book because as China was, this is 1995, as China had come out into the market and a middle class was starting to rise, meat consumption was going up, and he was worried that China's rise was going to shake up international markets, roil them, that food prices were going to start spiking, and that this was going to lead to mass starvation around the world. So who will feed China? This book caused a stir in China with these kinds of predictions. And it focused a lot of attention in Beijing. They even invited Lester Brown there to talk with them about food security issues. And they worried that a rising middle class would wreak havoc on global food markets. Now, during the last global food crisis, around 2007, 2008, it looked as though Lester Brown's predictions were starting to come true. And it looked to many people as though Africa was going to play a central role in China's food security plans. So my book, it's titled Will Africa Feed China? And it's an obvious spin on Lester Brown's book. And I wish more of you were familiar with his book because then you would prove my publisher right because he liked this title as opposed to the one I wanted, China's African Harvest. Okay, so these, the book itself examines 4 widespread beliefs about Chinese agricultural engagement in Africa. And the first belief is that the Chinese have actually acquired large amounts of land. The second is that the Chinese government is leading this effort. The third is that the purpose is to grow food to send back to China. And fourth, that they're sending Chinese farmers to do it. So let me read to you just a few things from the introduction, which these are all quotations that have come out in the media. China, the chief economist of the African Development Bank, wrote, China is the biggest land grabber in the world and in Africa. And China now has extensive holdings in African land acquisitions, including pending or attempted deals for millions of hectares in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Uganda, and Tanzania, with many thousands of Chinese workers brought in to work on these lands. Another quote from an article. From an Israeli news website, China's farms now control most of Zambia's agriculture. And CBS News, China recently purchased half the farmland under cultivation in the Congo. So, in terms of the Chinese government's involvement in this, the Daily Mail wrote, the strategy has been carefully devised by officials in Beijing. And at the Atlantic Council, a researcher said China has invested immense sums in African agriculture. Now, about the idea that this is about feeding China, the Rockefeller Foundation warned that, quote, the growing Chinese desire for African-produced food could mean poor people in African countries may no longer have the resources they need to survive. And in the French newspaper, an NGO in Benin said the Chinese are growing vegetables in Benin and sending them home to China. So finally, in terms of sending Chinese farmers there to grow this was in The Economist, that more than 1 million Chinese farmers were cultivating crops in Africa. Henning Mankell, the Swedish crime novelist, who's more known for his fiction than for his fact, he said he's Kurt Wallander. Yes, the Kurt Wallander mystery series. He told a journalist, I read just the other day that China has rented land in Kenya to move some 1 million peasants to Africa, and so on and so on. So these are just a few examples of things that have been out there in the media. And so I looked into all of these in this recent book. So I actually had a bit of a head start over a lot of people. This is a picture of me, that's me there in the middle, doing my first research in Africa. And as you can see there, I'm with Chinese agricultural experts and Liberian Ministry of Agriculture experts on a farm in Liberia. And this was in 1984. So I've been looking at what the Chinese are doing in Africa for quite a long time. Now, how did we then proceed to do the research for the current book? Well, first of all, I had a whole team of research assistants to collect every example they could find of a Chinese agricultural investment or purported investment. And eventually we put together a database of 60 cases, and we looked into them. And we did what I call, this is an example here. So, and on this you probably can't see because it's very little, but there are 2 cases here. One says, in 2007, China bought 2.8 million hectares in Congo for biofuel oil production. And the other one says, in 2008, they spent 800 million in Mozambique to expand rice production. Neither of these things actually ended up happening, but these are the kinds of examples that we collected. And then we did what I call forensic internet sleuthing. And what this is basically digging with Google. So it's digging into information on the internet and trying to track down the reality. And we found quite a bit of information about these cases, particularly the ones that weren't actually Chinese. So for one example, there was supposedly a $2 billion Chinese rice investment in Nigeria. And this took about 5 minutes to unpack. It turned out that it was a company called Ofada VT, And we Googled VT. Turns out it's a basmati rice company from India. It wasn't $2 billion, it turns out. It was 2 billion naira. And then after about 5 minutes, we found out that this 2 billion naira, which is about $17 million, was to pay for 3 rice mills to be imported from India. So there weren't any Chinese connected to this at all. So that was just one of the fastest examples of something that we were able to track down. Now, so that was one thing that we did, this forensic internet sleuthing. But we also went to these countries. And this is another example back, of course, in the day of how I did this. But I did this kind of thing over and over again in slightly better circumstances now. So this picture here is another co-researcher, 2 researchers that did this in Mozambique with me, Ingrid Ekman from Sweden, Sergio Chichava from Mozambique. So we did field work in 12 countries where the Chinese were supposed to be doing this investment. We went to the farms if they existed, and if they didn't, we talked to people to try to find out what had happened. And this was a picture from Zimbabwe when we were following this bus, which was shaking as it went along the road. But I just was thanking my lucky stars that I wasn't on the bus, because back when I was a student, I would be riding on that bus instead of in a friend's car there. So the third thing we did was we tracked down everything we could find that the Chinese have published about their incentive structure for investment in agriculture. So if they want to grab land and grow food and so on, they would put some incentives in place to make companies go and do this. And so we looked at all of the what the banks are doing, what the Ministry of Commerce is doing on all the seminars they've held, and what the message is that they're trying to get out to Chinese companies. And this is from a seminar in 2008 on Chinese enterprise outbound investment. And this is an example of the 21 largest projects that we collected at first. And I'm not going to tell you about all of these here, but I'm going to go through these really quickly to just give you some basic examples. So some of these were old foreign aid projects that had been around since the 1960s or 70s, and they weren't actually new investments or new land grabs, so we got rid of some of those. Then we found another group that were farms that Chinese companies had purchased in the 1990s or even a little more recently. But these were old, like 15-year-old investments. So we got rid of some of those. We also found a number that a Chinese entrepreneur had made a big statement about how big the project was going to be. And then when we tracked it down, we found out there wasn't actually anything that they had done yet at all. So a lot more disappeared there. In fact, I think there. And then we found projects that might happen at some point. They look quite promising, but they haven't happened yet, so we couldn't actually count those. And that left us with just 4 projects out of those 21. And so that took about 2 years to get to that point, maybe not quite that long. But these are all projects that we have either visited, someone on my team has visited, or we have otherwise tracked down, interviewed the Chinese companies that have done these investments. So that's pretty small. Now, these are a few pictures. This is from the China-Zambia Friendship Farm. I was there in 2013. This farm was from 1990. It's an investment that happened a long time ago. And the manager who was running it has been there since 2006. So I interviewed him. And he said to me, I said, why are you still here? Because usually these Chinese, it's a state-owned company. They usually circulate in and out. They're there for 3 years or so, and then they go home. He said, our daughter is in the American school in Lusaka, and it's our family's dearest wish that she come to study in America. So we have to stay here until she graduates from high school. So he also told me that Niall Ferguson from Harvard had been to interview him there. And at one point I asked him, I know you're growing wheat and you're growing soybeans here, and you say you're selling these to the local market, and I've certainly seen a lot of places where people are buying these here in Zambia, but do you have intentions to send these to China? And he laughed and he said, that's exactly what Niall Ferguson asked me. And he said, I said to him, if anyone wants to grow soybeans and wheat in Zambia and send them to China, they will have to put up with making a loss. So he obviously didn't think that's going to be very profitable. So this is a picture which is a little bit light for you there. But this is one of the random examples of old aid projects. This is from Somalia. So this was done by the Chinese in the 1970s. They set it up, they left, they went home, and then some travelers stumbled into it who were in Somalia. They took this picture and posted it on the internet. So it's an interesting example of something from long ago that still is there, and they still think of it as a Chinese farm. Another story that I want to tell you takes place, you can't really see this very well at all. Well, it's a picture of Mozambique, and it's a picture of agriculture, but it's not so important because the story that I want to tell you takes place not only in Mozambique, but also in Brazil. And it involves a Mozambican named Zaidi Ali. I met him just last November in Maputo. I had been trying to meet this guy since 2009. And I finally was able to track him down. You know how I found him? On LinkedIn. This is an example of the sleuthing that we do. So he was a LinkedIn member. I'm a LinkedIn member. I sent him a message. He responded. And I was going to Mozambique, so we agreed to meet in Maputo. He doesn't live in Maputo, but he was coming down for business. Zaidi Ali is someone of Indian background. His family has lived in Mozambique for 3 generations. And after the Mozambican Civil War, he became a teacher and then an entrepreneur. So he had a small hotel. He had some other businesses, a restaurant in Beira, which is in the north of Mozambique. And in 2003, he decided to become a farming entrepreneur. And so he leased 15,000 hectares from a state farm as Mozambique was privatizing. And he wanted to grow soybeans, but he didn't have a clue about how to grow soybeans. And so he went to Brazil, and he studied growing soybeans. He went and talked to a lot of people there. And during the course of his trip, he ran into this Chinese company that was there buying soybeans. And he ran into them again, and they got to be friendly. They stayed in the same hotel. And so he went back to Mozambique, but he had their business cards. And as he sat there in Mozambique, he thought, he brought back someone from Brazil to help him with the farm. But he kept thinking about those Chinese. And eventually he contacted them in Beijing, went to Beijing, proposed that they do a joint venture, and they were interested. So they came back to Mozambique in about 2005. He showed them the land. They decided they could work together, and they started a joint venture. And in the first 2 years, they had a disaster. So there was a drought, and there were an insect infestation. There was no infrastructure there to actually figure out what the problem was with the insects and what kind of chemicals to use. No extension agents, no research center. And then the company he was investing with, which was China Grain and Oils Corporation, was acquired by COFCO, China's big commodity traders. So there was a big thing of mergers and acquisitions, and they got caught. They got bought. And COFCO decided to can the Mozambique project, so they pulled out. And it failed. And Zaidi Ali lost a lot of money. So he told me about this, and he said, I almost lost my restaurant. He said, and my hotel, I'd use them as collateral for the mortgage to invest in the farm. And, but he said, those Chinese, I learned so much from them. And if they want to come back, I'm here. So that was an investment that didn't happen, another one. Then let me tell you about this one. This was supposed to be the 2.8 million hectare investment in the DRC. This was going to be actually a very large investment. And it was something set up by a Chinese telecommunications company, Zhongxing, ZTE Telecoms. So ZTE did come to the Congo. They were interested in doing a biofuels investment. They wanted to acquire a lot of land. So all of this is true. They really wanted to do this. But I eventually interviewed Wang Kewin, who was their general manager, the regional manager for the DRC. And his boss back in Shenzhen, where ZTE has its headquarters, had decided to set up an energy company. So they were moving into other sectors. And biofuels was something they were very interested in. So they came to the Congo to see if they could get land there. And the Congolese government was thrilled. They came in saying, we want to make a really big investment. Can you get a really big parcel of land for us? Eventually, they were able to get permission from the Congolese to have 100,000 hectares, which would have been a really large investment, not 2.6 3 or 2.8 million hectares, the way it was described, but still quite large. So Wang Kewin told me what happened next. He said that they were shown the area of land that they were given, and it was way in the interior of the Congo, along the Congo River. And so they took planes, and he brought experts in to look at the land, and they flew above it, and then they landed in the local airport, and they took soil samples, and it all looked quite promising. But the experts said to him, you know, you're going to have to build an oil palm refinery here to refine this into biofuel. And it's going to have to be right here because you can't bring those fruits out. They'll spoil. So you're going to have to bring everything up the river. There aren't any roads. And so Wang Kewin said, all right, I'll bring in a team of river experts from China and we'll take a boat up the river. And they did that. They hired a boat and they started going up the river to check out whether or not this could become their highway. And almost immediately they had problems. The boat broke down at least 3 times. They kept hitting sandbars because the river is not, it's a natural river. It hasn't ever been carved out for big boat traffic. And so the river experts said to Wang Kewin, it's going to take 100 years to basically get this river in the shape that you need to be able to make this a commercial investment. And so that investment also did not go forward. They did end up with a 200-hectare pilot project. And finally, the last project that I want to tell you about is actually a project that looks very much like an African project. It's Kumbu Kalani, who is the person there on the left. Kumbu Kalani Firi is a Zambian who got a Chinese government scholarship to go and study in China. He did a civil engineering degree. And while he was there, he met the woman who would later become his wife, and he fell in love. And so when he graduated, he didn't want to go back to Zambia quite yet. And so he got a job with a Chinese energy company. And this Chinese energy company was basically doing biofuel and other renewable energies in China. But they were ready to move out. And so Kumbu Kalani suggested to them that they come to Africa. They had been thinking about Indonesia. And he said he would go and check it out. So he came to Zambia, which is where he was from. And he met up with Thompson Sakala, who was a Zambian also interested in biofuels. And so the two of them, Thompson Sakala and Kumbu Kalani Firi, were the ones at the news conference when it was announced that China had requested 2 million hectares to do biofuels in Zambia. So of course they're both Zambian, but this was supposed to be a Chinese request, a Chinese government request, no less, and this was a private company. So this 2 million hectare request for land ends up boiling down to, with a lot of back and forth, and it's all being run by Thompson Sakala and Kumbu Kalani Firi, it ends up being 79,000 hectares that are eventually approved for allocation, but this has to be approved by the president because it's such a large chunk of land. And there's an election on. And so the president is hesitant to approve it. Then he loses the election. The new president comes in. His name is Michael Sata. He's not a friend of the Chinese. In fact, he was elected on an anti-Chinese platform. And so Michael Sata says, 79,000 hectares for Chinese projects, too big. I'll let you have 2,000. And they said, we can't get economies of scale with 2,000 as a pilot project. And so that project also ends up not going forward. So what are the Chinese actually doing in Africa? They are active in agriculture, but their goals are a lot different than what we thought with those 4 areas of conventional wisdom. So first of all, the Chinese have not acquired very much land. If you look at the 6,000 hectares, that if you add all those 60 cases up, it's 6,000 hectares. And what we found is that Chinese had actually acquired about 240,000 hectares. So it's much smaller than you imagine. And the Chinese government is not leading this. In fact, the companies kept complaining that the government was not supporting them and not helping them. And then the third, about what they were interested in growing, they're interested in biofuels, they were interested in rubber, they were interested in tobacco, cotton, but they were not interested in growing food to send back to China. And then the fourth, we found no evidence of Chinese farmers coming over in large numbers to Africa. In fact, there are some small Chinese farms there, and I'll show you one in a moment, but the people that are investing in farming are not from China are not usually farmers. They are investors and entrepreneurs, and they're coming into that sector because they think they can make money rather than coming because they're losing land in China or something like that. So the Chinese have 24 agricultural demonstration projects. Each of these combines a Chinese business usually to run it and to set it up, and it's supposed to be a business platform. So that's one thing they are interested in doing, in merging together business and foreign aid. So that's something they've done successfully many times before. And I would say that this doesn't sound like something that we do, except very recently we've gotten this new alliance for food security and nutrition out of the G8, and the U.S. is one of the members of this. And so this is the way that our foreign aid agency is working together with American companies to try to work on food security in Africa. So I thought that was quite interesting. The Chinese started doing it earlier than we did, but they're also working with their companies to have the aid program to work on agricultural engagement. And try to get business to be a part of that. So this is another example of one of these agri-technology demonstration centers, and this one is in Zimbabwe, and it's run by a Chinese company that basically sells Chinese machinery. And in this sense, they're also following in our footsteps. So this is an example of a John Deere tractor that we also have a market, although this actually comes from Brazil. But it is an American company. And they have, this is another agro-technology demonstration center in Cameroon. And this is a company that thought they would set the center up and then they would invest in a big project. And they ended up still, from 2005 to the present, they only have 100 hectares. They're also teaching their rice technology to men, which is kind of interesting because in that area it's usually women who do this area of production. And they're also interested in selling their services and their high technology. For example, this is Yuan Longping High Tech Group. They're running at least 2 of the agri-technology demonstration centers in Africa, and they want to, basically, they're in crop science, and they do a lot of research in hybrids, other areas of upgraded seeds, and that's what they would like to do in Africa. So finally, this is construction. So this is an example from Angola of a Chinese company that is helping the Angolan government. They're building state farms for Angola and constructing them and then providing technical assistance to get them up and running. So that's another area of business that they're looking at. These are the small farms. You can't really see very many Chinese farmers here, but let me just show you just right up here. You can see a few Chinese. The rest of these are all Zambian farmers in the local market. But these Chinese guys, these are actually, both of these are buying, but they're buying from a Chinese farmer who's selling the Chinese spring onions. There wasn't a lot of selection, but spring onions were popular there. And then finally here is a woman I talked to in Mozambique. She's in a big Chinese project, which is one of the largest we found, 20,000 hectares, and that's a picture of it over on the right there. But she's a contract farmer for this company. And so they have contract farmers that are growing rice in this case and then selling it to the company, which is an agro-processing company. So what does China want? And who's going to feed China? This is a picture from Brazil. Basically, China is importing its food, the soybeans and the corn that it's using to feed its pigs and its chickens, and it's importing it from the Americas. So the corn is coming from the United States, and the soybeans are coming from Argentina and Brazil. And so far, it doesn't look as though Africa is going to be a major supplier of these commodities. So let me end by telling you one more little story, which is that in 1966, the first president of Congo Brazzaville wrote that Africa was under threat of a Chinese communist colonization, and I'm quoting him here, coherent, logical, and terribly effective, which would in due course turn the entire continent into a gigantic rice field. So this was a concern back in 1966. Of course this didn't happen, and it's not happening now. the Chinese are not building a new empire in Africa. Rather, Chinese firms are part of a new wave of globalization. This really started for the Chinese in the 1980s as their reforms were happening at home. Chinese agribusiness companies are going out in the footsteps of companies like Swiss seed giant Syngenta, U.S. tractor manufacturer John Deere, the European commodities firm Louis Dreyfus, and even Firestone Tire, which is the American big plantation in Liberia. They also have their biggest investment is actually a rubber plantation. The Chinese biggest investment is a rubber plantation in Cameroon that they purchased from the Cameroonian government. So they are, as Edward Steinfeld has said, they're playing our game. And the sooner we realize this, the sooner we'll be prepared to work more constructively with China to help ensure that Africa one day will be able to feed itself, and then perhaps in the not too distant future also help to feed China. Thank you.
So we have some time for questions. Yeah. Can you identify yourself and talk loudly so the people behind you can hear you?
Sure. So my name is Andrew. I'm from the Environmental School of Peru. First, thank you very much for taking the time to come chat with us about this. One question I have is about how the English media's portrayal of China's presence in Africa. Some commentators will say that it's overblown because Africa seems to be almost a political battleground between the United States or Western countries and China, whereas kind of what you're portraying here makes it seem more like it's just lazy journalism. So I kind of wonder where you fall on that. Why do you think it's so sensationalized?
I don't think that Africa is a political battleground between the West and China. I think actually China and both sides, I think, understand that their interests are quite complementary in a way. So, for example, in our aid program, we put a lot of money into health. The Chinese put very little into health, but they put a lot of money into infrastructure. We don't put much into infrastructure. So we're keeping more people alive, and they're providing the infrastructure that's going to enable them to get to the hospitals and so on, and get the medicines in and go for treatment. So there's a lot of complementarity there. I do think there's a concern more generally in the West about China's rise. And so we see this most recently in the South China Sea, so that's become a very headline issue. We see it with concern about the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and the U.S. made what I think is a stupid decision not to join. You know, it's the U.S. and Japan, and I think even the U.K. joined. So it's kind of the U.S. and Japan that decided not to go in. And so I think there's more, that fits in with the idea that there's a threat there and that we should distance ourselves from it. Rather than, I think even in Europe, they were much more constructive about joining in with AIIB and deciding to work inside. And that's, so to answer the second part of your question, I do think a lot of this is lazy journalism. But it's the kind of journalism that got through all the editors because it fit a preconceived notion that we had about what China wants. No land, lots of people. Surely they're going to want to export all those people to Africa. And a lot of people in Africa believe that as well. It even seemed like a good idea to some Chinese. So it hasn't become a government policy, but there are Chinese who said, why don't we do it? What a great idea.
Malti?
Grabbing is a very real concern in many African countries. It's just not very clear what role China plays in it. A recent book by Lorenzo Catula argues that most land grabbing is done by citizens of their own country. Just my question to you would be, where do you see China's role both in terms of the causes of land grabs and potential solutions to the problem?
I have Lorenzo's book, and I agree with his argument. From what I can see, it is African investors who are the ones that are are the most interested. Although if you look at the data on some of these databases, it looks like it's still European and American in terms of the largest number, with the Chinese not so big anymore. This is a very complicated question, and I don't know how I can give an easy answer to this. I do in the book have a whole chapter in which I look at all of these questions about commercial agriculture in Africa and what this means. And this is a hugely controversial area. If you want to look at a Marxist perspective on this, I think Marxists would say that in a lot of parts of Africa, you are in a pre-capitalist situation in which primitive accumulation hasn't happened yet. Does anyone even know what that term means, primitive accumulation?
Say
Nope.
that again.
Primitive accumulation.
I thought you said that.
Yeah, you haven't heard that for decades, have you? Anyway, the idea of primitive accumulation is that the first stages of capitalism, basically you have to get land, and you have to invest in the land then and get your profits from that, and then you accumulate that, and then you put that into other areas like manufacturing and so on. That's from that perspective. But you can look at it from a completely different, you don't have to look at Marx to try to understand something about how African rural areas are largely pre-capitalist or not capitalist. So it's subsistence farming. What does that mean for the future? Will they be able to retain that? Will they turn into small yeoman farmers who, each one is part of the market and part of and staying there on the farm and improving their technology? That has not been the pattern in most parts of the world. It has been like in Taiwan, even China's consolidating more. But those questions about what the future is for rural Africa are extremely contentious. And many African governments do not believe that the future lies with the subsistence farmer and bringing them into the market and commercializing that. So they look at that as backward. They just want to bring in big investors and commercialize on a big scale. So I don't have the answer to that. I know Lorenzo's one of the people who believes very much in the small-scale farmer. The World Bank is very big on that, although that's also, they have a division of opinion there about the role for scaling up agriculture. So where the Chinese fit? They'll fit wherever the incentive structure points them, basically. If there's interest in having them come in by the government, by African government, they'll explore it. And if they wanted to be big scale, they would be interested. They just couldn't make it happen. It's not to say that they're just good guys and they didn't do it out of the goodness of their heart. They wanted to. They just didn't want to grow food to send back to China, but they would have liked to do biofuels back when that looked like it would be profitable. So.
Yep.
Yes, my name is Alvin Chung. I have been
Talk a little louder.
Yeah, I've been to Ethiopia and Zimbabwe and made investment in Zimbabwe as well.
In what sector?
Gold. So I agree with you that there is not much trade between China and Africa in terms of agriculture, because all the ship shipped the goods made in China to Africa, but when they came back, it's always empty. So there is not much trading. But I observed one thing that is, especially in Ethiopia, there is huge construction. It's everywhere. You go everywhere, you see some construction, and it's really huge. Clearly, China has been investing in Africa in construction sector. What's the purpose of that? And can they make money from it? Because most of the construction, I assume, is from loan. It's not paid by the African country.
The first Chinese companies to do construction projects in Africa for profit, not for the Chinese government, this happened in 1979. So those companies were there doing Chinese aid projects. And then as China moved to the market and the responsibility system was developed so that companies that belonged to ministries could seek profits and then they could keep some of that profit for themselves, those companies that were there building China's foreign aid projects started looking for contracts that they could get. And I saw this happening all through the 80s. So they were there already. So in Nigeria, this is where this happened, and in Niger. And those companies have been bidding on contracts ever since. So you can look at the data on this, the turnover and contracts from overseas business in the construction sector. This is published every year. And it just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And in Africa now, this is about, I think it's about a quarter of the business now, maybe even more, is just coming from Africa, this offshore business. And it is about over $40 billion a year of turnover for Chinese companies in Africa doing these construction projects. And these are not mostly financed by the Chinese. I would say at most 25%. And so in Ethiopia, there are a few really big ones, but there are a lot of roads and other things that are being done in Ethiopia that are not financed out of Chinese loans. In Nigeria, very active. They're doing projects all over the country, and it's for the state governments, and Nigeria has oil wealth, and this goes out to the states, so they hire Chinese companies to build infrastructure. And it happens all over. So lots of private, government, and so on. And this is Africa every year should be spending $90 billion on infrastructure. And they're spending a lot less than that, but the Chinese companies would like to get every single one of those contracts. And it is profitable. It's also very competitive. So I think the profit margins are low, but it is profitable.
Thank
Hi, my name is Ben. I'm an undergraduate at Yale College. So it seems that for any type of kind of transfer of food, particularly between countries at such a large level, for such a large population, is there a lot of kind of investments in infrastructure that need to be made? As you mentioned, there was the problem with roads and rivers. And I'm wondering is this something that's purely solved through either the private sector or through kind of aid, or otherwise, what's the source of these public goods?
For infrastructure, most of this is going to have to be done by governments because there aren't that many cases where you can do things like roads in Africa where it could be profitable to have a public-private partnership. Like having a toll road, you really need to have a density. And there aren't that many examples. There are only two that I know of that Chinese companies are interested in. They're actually doing toll roads. One is in Ethiopia, and the other one is in Uganda. And all the other roads that they built are not toll roads. They're all ones for governments, or mostly for governments, and then the governments are maintaining them. So that has to be a government investment. There are possibilities for public-private partnerships in ports. So there is interest in that, and there aren't any that have gotten really far along, but there's a lot of interest all around the continent, on the west, the east, the south, in the port infrastructure. And the railroads, railroads that the Chinese are building are all for African governments. So that, again, in Ethiopia, in Nigeria, in Angola, and now this one that's going from across Kenya up to Uganda, and maybe beyond, and hooking up possibly down with the Tanzan Railway that was built so long ago by the Chinese. So the infrastructure projects they're pretty much done, some financed by the Chinese. I would say about 10, from 8 to 11 or 12 billion a year, no more than that, and probably less. Foreign aid in general, and this is not mostly foreign aid funding from the Chinese, some of it is, but a lot of it is not. It's commercial rate. Our government has not been funding much infrastructure. It's just not what we do, and the Europeans don't fund that much either. The World Bank is starting to move into that, but they had also really moved away from it. So there weren't really a lot of other possible sources for that funding. And the Chinese, for them, that was win-win, because all of their funding is tied to Chinese companies in practical sense. So it's generating business for the firms that were already there, and some of them are new and coming in and getting that business as well. So one last thing about infrastructure, which is that in China there's a saying, 要想富, 先修路, which is if you want to become prosperous, first build a road. They really believe this. And Norman Borlaug, who was the father of the Green Revolution, he once said about Africa that it needs three things: roads, roads, and roads. So this idea is out there that you need roads in order to move up the development ladder.
So based on the infrastructural interest that China has sort of really been acting on in several African countries, which you've acknowledged here, do you think that, or do you believe that agriculture could be, especially in terms of like the African continent, could be a big part of Chinese foreign policy in the future?
I think that from what I hear from the African side, they're very interested in partnering with China. I don't think that the Chinese, they have, for example, there's a China-Africa Agricultural Investment Fund, but it's just 1 billion renminbi, which is about $161 million. It's not very big, and that's like for all of Africa. So and I don't see that they want to put a whole lot, because they're having a lot of trouble finding investable opportunities, ones where they think they can make money. So for the government, they're not going to put a lot of foreign aid money into this because they don't have a lot of foreign aid money. They don't have really big, they do construction really through the foreign aid. And I don't think that they're going to put a lot of investment money into it because it just, by and large right now, it's not looking that promising, and even for the future. So, and let me give you an example of where they are putting their money that's related to agriculture. There's a line of credit, just one Chinese company, which is COFCO, the big commodities trader. They have a line of credit from, I think, China Development Bank. It might be also from Exim Bank, but it's $9 billion just for one company. And that is to go into the commodity markets and to become a commodity trader and to set up those silos and do that kind of work. So that's what they want. They want to, right now they believe they can feed the Chinese through the commodity markets, buying in America, buying in Brazil. I hope we don't do something that shakes that confidence, because that would really be a problem.
Morgan?
Hi, I'm Morgan again. So I know that it's pretty clear China's interest in the extractive industry in terms of oil in Africa. Is China's interest in biofuels in Africa, is that unique to Africa, or has China been investing in that sphere in other countries as well?
The biofuels interest really comes out of that same period of around 2008 or so when prices were high. They weren't just high for food, they were also high for oil. And so oil prices were very high, and a lot of companies thought that biofuels would be a really good investment. But then the oil prices crashed, and they're really low now. So biofuels are not a good investment anymore. And most of the Chinese companies who looked into biofuels were looking in Asia. So they were looking in Indonesia, even the Philippines, Papua New Guinea, there, not in Africa. There are very few examples.
Hi, my name's Aya. I'm also a Yale undergraduate. I was wondering if there are particular countries in Africa that look more favorably upon Chinese investment. You mentioned some political problems in Zambia and Congo and sort of pushing out the Chinese. Are there particular regions that aren't quite like that?
I think that Zambia is kind of unique in that the Chinese presence became an issue in their presidential elections, not just once, several times. And so that was, there aren't any other countries that I can think of right now where it was really like a top-level issue in a presidential campaign. Zambia didn't push the Chinese out. They didn't approve that one investment. There's still a lot of Chinese investors in Zambia. And the country where the most Chinese investments and the largest value is South Africa. So that is a very attractive area still for Chinese to invest. They also have come a lot to Nigeria, which is not a terribly attractive investment environment. I talked to one Chinese shoe company there, and they had one branch that had invested in Russia and one that had invested in Nigeria. And so they said they were closing the one in Russia and bringing it to Nigeria because it was a better investment environment. So I think that's the kind of comparison they were making. It was a lot better than in Russia. So by and large, Chinese investment has been welcomed. The one area where it's been more controversial, I think, aside from Zambia, for local people, it has been in things that have environmental impact or in labor relations. So those are more problems with labor relations. These are cultural issues that are quite contentious and very serious. And the thing I hear the most complaints about is labor relations and African employees and Chinese managers. And then the environment is also an issue with regard to Chinese demand for protected species. I hear about that. And forestry. So forest species, animal species, there's a lot of demand in China for these. And that's a problem.
My name is Ben. I'm a senior undergraduate at Yale College. So I thought it was interesting hearing how you talked about a lot of these projects that ultimately didn't get off the ground, even though they seemed promising at first. And it seems like some of the negotiation processes for undertaking these projects with China seems pretty complex. I'm wondering how this compares to projects that the World Bank or other development banks might take on. So, I mean, it seems like China doesn't necessarily want to force situations to happen if there isn't like if the scenario isn't right. Does the World Bank similarly cancel a lot of projects, or is it a bit of a different process?
Well, you're really comparing an apple and an orange there, because the projects that I've been talking about are all investment projects. These are all like, private investment, even sometimes it might be a state-owned company. It's private investment. What the World Bank funds is development projects. And those are all negotiated with the government, and the World Bank is providing something that the government wants and is providing a loan so that they can carry it out. So it wouldn't get canceled at the end because of some kind of difficulty with, and they don't do areas things that take a whole lot of land usually. It's not a big land intensive direction. So they wouldn't have the same kind of experience. But what you didn't ask, and what I will answer now, is whether or not investors from other countries have the same kinds of problems. And I'd say absolutely. And I was told that over and over again. The Chinese said to me that they talked to other people, like from Brazil, Europe, and so on. They said everybody's having trouble. So it's not just us. So it's difficult. And I think that ultimately that suggests that it's difficult to invest in Africa, and certainly investing in agriculture is really hard. And that's why so few of these really large land grab investments have actually gone forward. And I think that's I know it's true for the Chinese because I've investigated this in minute detail. But I have a colleague who's done it for the Gulf states in all the Qatar and Abu Dhabi and all of those countries, and he found the same thing. They had the same kinds of problems, and there was very little land transfer that actually happened for them either. Now, this could all change at some point, and I was hoping it didn't change before the book was finished, but if food prices spike up again, this might, or if oil prices spike up again, it creates new incentives for the biofuels and so on. But I think this first wave, for the Chinese anyway, it was a bitter experience for these companies, and the word is out. That's not easy. And I think future companies coming in will be a little bit more conservative in terms of the amount of land that they might request or how big they think their investment can be.
Yep.
Brian, visiting student from Hong Kong. Regardless of this failed attempt of Chinese agriculture investment, I wonder what were done at the first place by local government to make this land available for the investment, for Chinese investment or others. And I assume that there are people's lives who rely on this land. And what has changed their lives? And are they be able to come back to the land even though the investment is failed?
Well, that's a good question. That last part I don't know. But the first part is that most of this land that was under discussion was under traditional landholding systems. So some of it, the ones that were successful actually are the ones in which it used to be a state farm or it was an acquisition of an existing plantation. Those things were successful. But the ones where it was all traditional land, this gets into the complications of land tenure systems in Africa. So there is an assumption in many countries that the government owns all the land. There's all the government, but yet there are overlapping land tenure systems. So there are traditional land tenure systems too, where the land is is owned by tribal groups and communities. And so these came into conflict because the government said to the Chinese investors, yes, we can allocate land for you. And then they found that actually it wasn't so easy because they had to convince these traditional communities to give over the land, and they had a hard time doing that. And people protested when they thought they were going to be moved off their land. And so there are very few cases in which they were, that they went ahead and really moved people off. So that gets to your final part of that question, which is, can people go back to the land? Most of the time, they never left. So it never got to the point where they had to leave. And so the project didn't go forward. They still are on the land and so on.
Yep, Scott?
Hey, I'm Scott. I'm a second-year MBA student. My question has to do with corruption in Africa. And a lot lot of people would contend that one of Africa's most significant developmental challenges is not just an avoidance of conflict, but is actually managing corruption, and mainly within the government. Unlike the United States or the UK or OECD, China does not have an enforceable convention against corruption like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or BSA. Do you think that China essentially is a net contributor to African corruption?
Let me address that in 3 ways, or with 3 points. The first is that the Chinese actually, if you look at the history of trying to combat corruption, the United States has really taken a leading role there. We signed the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in 1977, and it took another 20 years before the Europeans signed it. They signed on with the OECD Convention Against Corruption, so now Europe is on board as well. But if you look at any of the research on how that's enforced, it's enforced very poorly. So look across Europe, they're not enforcing, by and large, very well their own corrupt practices. The Chinese actually do have legislation now on foreign corrupt practices. This was as a result of signing the UN Convention. But we don't know whether or not it's enforceable. It doesn't look like it. We don't know what the mechanisms are. So that's just background for this. So are the Chinese making corruption worse? This is something that my friend Paul Collier said in The Bottom Billion, and I took him to task for that because I said, you don't have any evidence on this. It's possible. Certainly, Chinese companies are ranked, along with Indian companies, as the most likely to pay bribes of all the foreign companies operating in Africa. But on the other hand, the way the Chinese fund their infrastructure projects through these big loans, the money never goes into the African government. It stays in China and is used to pay the company there. And so what that does, it reduces embezzlement risk. And we have a lot of banks operating in places like Angola, where they're just channeling large amounts of money to the Angolan government with no strings attached at all. And that is a huge risk for embezzlement. And we've actually seen this coming out in places like Equatorial Guinea as well. So the Chinese, I think, contribute to reducing the risk of embezzlement with the way they finance projects. They probably increase the risk of kickbacks with the way they obtain the projects.
So I think that's more so what I was getting at. It's less to do with financing, but in terms of, I worked as an anti-corruption consultant in Latin America on most deals that were tenders. Anytime a Chinese investment group was participating, we would tell our clients to walk away, that there were going to be kickbacks, and that if they didn't want to have to match that and possibly be persecuted under the FCPA, and I would argue that reduces competition. Do you think that in that respect, China perhaps is not the best partner for Africa to have?
Well, I'm not saying that China is the best partner for Africa to have. I'm saying that that there's a lot of corruption in China and there's a lot of corruption in Africa. So I'm sure there is a lot of corruption happening in Chinese engagement in Africa. I'm not sure that is the worst thing that's impeding development on the continent. There is this joke, however, of the joke that I heard. It was at the Kennedy School. Sorry about SOM students who may be in the audience. But you had a Nigerian and a Korean who had been students at the Kennedy School. And the Nigerian went to visit the Korean. And they both ended up working for their governments. And the Korean lived in a really nice apartment. And so the Nigerian said, well, how did you afford this? And he said, look at that bridge, 10%. So a year later, the Korean went to visit the Nigerian. And he lived in a palatial house. And he said, how could you afford this on your government salary? He said, you look at that bridge? And the Korean said, what bridge? And he said, 100%. So, so it could be that the scale of corruption is a lot higher. But certainly in East Asia, there's been a lot of corruption and a lot of development too. So it's not a positive force, but it may not be the thing that's really holding Africa back.
Okay, we have time for 3 more questions. Yeah.
James Sumquist, political science graduate student. You started this talk with the question of Chinese food security, and then you said basically that Africa is not going to feed China at least as much as we expect. So is the Chinese government concerned about that, or do they say, oh, we're getting enough from the Americas? Are they as concerned about it as they were in '95?
Well, they're concerned about food security, make no mistake about that. They just don't see that Africa is going to be supplying their food. And this is what the government's been saying all along. And officials would say things like, you know, we can't rely on Africa for our food. How could we, like, people are starving in Africa. How can we, like, expect them to come and send food to China? So what I see them doing is basically looking for a lot of different options and obtaining food in Latin America. In rice, I think they're going to continue to do rice and wheat at home. So they'll probably go in the direction that Japan went on rice. And in Japan, they have 800% tariffs on rice. So they protect their local rice farmers. They're rice self-sufficient. I imagine that China will probably move in that direction with the rice and wheat. But they are moving, they're doing the globalization thing. They bought Smithfield Farms, which is our big pork producer here. So they're moving out to acquire companies, mergers, acquisitions, and so on, which is what we've been doing. So I do think it'll be a more normal kind of food supply situation in which it involves trade and not the thing about trying to grow it yourself and then somehow, you know, secure that and send it all the way back the way we thought it was going to happen, or the way many people thought was going to happen.
I'm asking the second question, which is about the political influence of Chinese government to the African countries. I've heard that the Chinese is building a military training academy in Zimbabwe, and I still remember that when South Sudan and North Sudan have the conflict, the president came to China to ask for the suggestion. So will China play a positive role or negative role in Africans' political situation, and how will that evolve going forward?
Will they play a positive role in African politics? You know, I think the Chinese in general don't want to be involved in African politics. So they really would prefer just to stay out of that, from what I can see. This non-interference policy is just a lot more convenient than trying to get involved in the actual, in politics in terms of elections or in terms of trying to influence. They would like, when it comes to influencing for business, yes. They would want to influence governments to choose them. They want to influence governments to build things and then have Chinese banks finance them and so on. And that's where the Zimbabwe Military Academy comes in. This is a construction project. So the company that built that wanted to build a big project. The Zimbabwean government, the Defense Department loved the idea. It's this huge, I've been there, it's this huge, it basically looks like a real estate development, not a military academy. It's got house after house after house, and it's quite nice looking with a whole fence around it. And this was secured with diamonds from a joint venture between the construction company and the Ministry of Defense. And the profits from that diamond mine that they invested in together are repaying the loan, which is actually a foreign aid loan that built that military academy. So would this help? Is this somehow going to bolster Mugabe? Quite possibly. It is certainly strengthening the military and providing nice places for the generals to live. Absolutely. It's interesting, there's a similar military college being built in Namibia, which is, you know, just down the way from Zimbabwe. No one ever talks about that one. And I think there's also one in Tanzania. But there are the Chinese build things, and they'll build things for the military, they'll build things for the Ministry of Health, whatever you want.
Hi, I'm Wai from second year from School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. I was wondering, can you comment on Huawei's investment in Africa? Because I think Huawei has been maybe the dominant telecom company in a lot of African countries, and it seems like the Chinese company is more interested in the market or the labor instead of material commodity. Is that true? And how do you...
Huawei is one of the largest telecoms companies in the world, and they have a big rivalry with Zhongxing Telecommunications, ZTE. And they are together, they're in a lot of African countries competing with each other, like in Ethiopia. They've competed quite a bit. Huawei, I would say that most of what they do in Africa is not so much investment. Like they don't buy things, they don't own things. They have their own companies, but they provide services. So they will build things. And when you look at how the telecoms revolution in Africa has been extraordinary. You can get cell phone reception in very remote parts of Ethiopia now. You can take your cheap handset and you can find out the price of your agricultural commodities, or you can call someone if your wife is in labor to try to help her to get to a hospital. You just have that communications ability now, and it is because Huawei and Zhongxing Telecommunications are building that infrastructure across the continent for Vodafone and for MTN and for all of the African telecoms companies that actually own it. So they don't own that stuff. They just build it and maintain it. And that takes having offices all over the place and training academies. So one of the projects we want to look at is the training academies of Huawei, because it's really interesting. They're cycling Africans through these training academies so that they can man these projects, because otherwise they were bringing people in from Europe and China to do it, and it was too expensive.
You're going to get the last question.
No, I'm Andres del Rio, student of Master of Advanced Management. You told us that governments in Africa are not, some of them are not very open to Chinese investments. They are different. So, in your opinion, what is why there are some countries that they are not open to Chinese investment? Because of course the development is very good for all of them.
I'm sorry if I gave the impression that some countries feel like they aren't open to Chinese investment, because I think every country in Africa is open for Chinese investment. There are some in which they've had problems, and some in which the challenges have been bigger, and some in which the labor relations have been fierce and intense. So there are problems with a lot of these, and lots of different stories about that. I told you some of the stories on agriculture. But I don't know of a single case where the country itself is not. There may be individuals within it. There may be civil society groups that are suspicious about the Chinese. Certainly in South Africa that would be the case. But in general, the investment there's a welcome. There's a real welcome. They like having, and they like it because, as a Nigerian said to me, you know, the West comes to Nigeria and they are interested in oil, and nothing but oil. But the Chinese come and they're interested in every sector of our economy, and we like that.
I thought you said that there were some parties or some leaders that they
Michael Sata, yeah. Michael Sata, he used this in his election campaign. He said the Chinese are investors, not investors. He said if he was elected, he would recognize Taiwan. He was elected, he didn't recognize Taiwan. So he used this as a campaign tool, and he got elected. And then after he got elected, the first person he invited to the presidential mansion was the Chinese ambassador. So basically he was saying, I was just kidding.
Well, American politicians have been known to do the same thing with respect to the Chinese. But before I draw our proceedings to a close, let me just say that after the lecture, please join us upstairs on the second floor for a reception and continue the conversation. Thank you so much. It's really been a treat to listen to you this afternoon.
It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure. Thank you. Very good question. Thank you. Thank you.